In the year 1988, as a symbol of the liberalization of religion in the late Soviet Union, the Russian Orthodox Church widely celebrated 1000 years of the Christianization of Rus. This was followed by the rise of interest in religion and Orthodox Christianity in particular. A huge wave of neophytes and formal Orthodox laymen reinventing their faith filled the churches. However, both the date, year 988, and the process of Christianization are not exactly clear-cut historic events. Neither means that the Russian Church was born that year, or that she is still the same church nowadays. Moreover, the critics contest the idea of a 1000-year-old Russian Church from different standpoints, claiming that what we now call the Russian Orthodox Church was born much later and has virtually nothing in common with the true Russian Church that ended at some point in history. Critics attribute this to the external influence of the Russian state, oftentimes facilitated by internal conflicts within the Church. Let me address the most popular and widely discussed historical events that sparked the theological, historical, and political debates about the origins of the modern Church and her authenticity. First, the Christianization of Rus. As I have already said, the year 988 is a conventional date. Historians dispute the exact year, but in any case, what exactly happened around that time? For starters, in that time there was no Russia yet, and would not be for at least 500 years. Many Eastern Slavic tribes, colloquially known as Russians, were organized in city-states headed by warlord princes. They were in constant movement, some more powerful, some less, some in war, some in an alliance. Long before Moscow was even founded, the most powerful state was Kievan Rus, with the same capital as today's Ukraine. Some of the early princes were Christians, but neither of them considered converting their armies, much less their subjects. Along came Vladimir, the prince of Kiev and Novgorod. Accumulating significant power and land, he recognized the role of religion in centralizing power. At first, he reorganized the pantheon of local gods and established a hierarchy of their idols in Kiev. Eventually, he realized the benefits of monotheistic religion and an alliance with the powerful Byzantium Empire. He Christianized his lands and his people while overcoming their fierce resistance. Many people didn't want to give up their pagan gods and were forced to do so. In some places, like Novgorod, this resulted in a bloodbath. The official narrative and Vladimir's life story as a saint describe how he chose faith for his people. Vladimir turned down Muslim envoys for their rejection of alcohol, which he claimed was a joy for Russians. He rejected Jewish envoys because they lost their fatherland, and the Latin Rite Church, future Roman Catholics, because he claimed that his forefathers had rejected the authority of the Pope. Finally, a Greek Orthodox envoy convinced and converted Vladimir. One of the active participants in the Christianization of Rus and the bishop who baptized Vladimir himself was Metropolitan Mikhail, sent from the Patriarchate of Constantinople. Mikhail became the first Metropolitan of Kiev, and his eparchy became a part of the Orthodox Church of Constantinople. It is up for debate whether the Russian Church started with these events even as a part of the Patriarchate of Constantinople. Further on, especially with the fall of Byzantium in the 15th century, the Russian metropolia became very powerful and much more dependent on secular power than on the Patriarchate. The second event that allows many people to claim the formal establishment of the Russian Church is the institution of the Moscow Patriarchate. After the downfall of Kiev during the Mongol rule, the center of political power shifted to the city of Vladimir and later to Moscow. By that time, the accumulation of Russian lands resulted in the unified Russian state with Orthodox Christianity as the state religion and ideology, supporting the power of the monarch. The last head of the Russian Church with the title of the Metropolitan of Kiev, Iona, moved his cathedra to Moscow, which has been the center of the Russian Church ever since. After the fall of Byzantium, the Russian Church became the most powerful Eastern Orthodox Church, yet it was formally still subordinated to Constantinople. During the rule of Tsar Boris Godunov, Patriarch Jeremiah II came to Moscow to collect the financial contribution. He was greeted with a very warm welcome and gifts, but was practically put under house arrest. After a series of negotiations and immense pressure put on him by the Russian secular and church power, he was forced to grant autocephaly to the Russian Church and recognize Patriarch Iov. Later, 2 councils of the Constantinople Patriarchate confirmed that decision. Whatever opinion one might have on the Church up to this point, the institution of the Patriarchate formally established the autocephalous Russian Orthodox Church. One might claim that the participation of the secular power was too active and intrusive, but as we are going to see further, all major reforms in the Church have been conducted either directly or under the immense pressure of the state power. Next, in the 17th century, the Church was shaken and eventually split by the major reform and the consequent Great Schism. For all believers who emerged as a result of that schism, the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow lost her legitimacy and authenticity. The church reform was initiated by the Patriarch Nikon, who was a very controversial figure in the church history. After Tsar Mikhail Romanov co-ruled with Patriarch Filaret, his own biological father, this practice continued with his son Alexei and his childhood spiritual mentor, Patriarch Nikon. Nikon's ambitions, however, interfered with Alexei's, and eventually he was dethroned for the last time in the history of the Moscow Patriarchate, at least so far. Nikon initiated a great liturgical reform, authorizing a new translation of service books from Greek. A big part of the church, headed by influential married priests, rejected the reform, claiming the authenticity of the old books and ultimately the old ritual. Nicknamed Old Ritualists and Old Believers, they were harshly persecuted, excommunicated, exiled, tortured, and executed in large numbers. The movement, however, persisted and significantly multiplied. Since the very start, Old Believers have not been one community, but rather an umbrella term for multiple very different groups, concords, and churches. The most common distinction of Old Believers is between priestly and priestless. This does not just mean that some groups have priests and others don't. The reasons for that are the canonical rule of apostolic succession. Orthodox Christians only recognize clergy that is ordained by bishops who have a direct, uninterrupted succession of ordination from apostles. Hence, the priestly groups believe they could preserve the succession, and hence they represent the authentic Russian Church. The priestless believe that this succession was interrupted with the church reform of Nikon, which, among other things, corrupted the liturgy of baptism and ordination. Hence, there could be no priests because there is no bishop left to ordain one. The priestless groups continue to practice their faith with major rituals, like matrimony performed by laymen, but the authentic Russian Church, according to them, ceased to be. The fourth historic event that puts the authenticity of the modern Russian Church into question was the church reform of Peter the Great. A son of Tsar Alexei, Peter is remembered as one of the greatest reformers in Russian history. Shifting power from the old aristocracy and thus eliminating competition, he reformed practically all spheres of Russian society, from the state governance to the church leadership. He even moved the capital from Moscow, controlled by the rival aristocratic clans, to the newly founded city of St. Petersburg, my native city. After the death of Patriarch Adrian in the year 1700, Peter did not authorize the election of the new one. 20 years later, he established a collegium, later renamed the Holy Synod, which became the governing body of the Church for 200 years. The supreme ruler of the Synod formally was the monarch himself, with the chief procurator, a secular state officer, as the acting leader of the Church. Practically, the Church became a state department, governed, controlled, and financed by secular power. Only after the abdication of the last monarch, Nicholas II, did the Church restore the Patriarchate and elect Patriarch Tikhon in 1917, shortly before the Bolshevik Revolution. Many people claim that Peter's reform put an end to an autonomous church, although her independence from the state power at any point in history is highly contested. Lastly, the Soviet power did not just attempt to eradicate religion and the Orthodox Church in particular, but, after the failure to do so, eventually put the Church under strict control. Many critics say that Patriarch Tikhon was the last legitimate church leader, and starting from his successor, Patriarch Sergei, the church is no longer authentic. Elected a few months before the establishment of the Soviet regime, Patriarch Tikhon was persecuted by the authorities, especially by the end of his life. In the 1920s, with the rise of the state-supported renovationist movement, Tikhon was declared an ex-patriarch, apprehended, interrogated, and eventually put under house arrest in a monastery. By the end of his life, he was not indicted, but lived under constant pressure of prosecution and condemnation from the renovationists. Tikhon died in 1925, and Metropolitan Pyotr was appointed as a placeholder. At the peak of renovationism, the state power did not allow the election of a new patriarch, and Metropolitan Pyotr remained a placeholder until the rumors of his death in 1936, a year prior to his actual execution in prison. His successor, Metropolitan Sergei, would eventually become a patriarch in 1943. The renovationist movement died out in the 1930s, when Stalin's regime stopped supporting the schismatics and repressed them together with the legitimate church and practically all religious movements. Metropolitan Sergei, who allied with the renovationists and would later publicly repent of that, is associated by many people with the collaboration with the godless state and hence putting an end to a legitimate, authentic Russian Orthodox Church. In 1927, Sergei issued a highly controversial proclamation to the clergy and the faithful of the Church. While the Patriarch placeholder, Metropolitan Pyotr, was behind bars, Sergei, a de facto head of the Church, called the Church to obedience to the state and compliance with the state ideology. Although he acknowledged that the state was atheistic, Orthodox Christians were called to be good and compliant citizens. Besides, the immigrant Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia was called to recognize the Soviet state, commemorate its leadership in liturgy, and pledge allegiance. The proclamation almost caused another schism. Many parishes and whole eparchies fiercely rejected it. Most of the church saw the Soviet regime as temporary and was waiting for the restoration of the power of the church. For Sergei and his supporters, however, this act gave the opportunity to officially register the governing structures of the church, such as the Holy Synod, for the first time since the start of Soviet rule. Eventually, in 1943, Sergei was chosen as the compromise figure for the state power and the church bishops who survived the repressions of the 1930s. Some dozen bishops congregated in Moscow in a council initiated by Stalin and his security service agency called the MGB, and elected Sergei a patriarch. The Russian Orthodox Church was practically restored, re-established, but put under total state control through the newly created Council for the Affairs of the Russian Orthodox Church. Until the perestroika in the mid-1980s, all bishops, including the Patriarch, were controlled and approved by the state. Since then, the Church gained a reputation as the KGB project, and all important bishops have been rumored to be KGB agents. Patriarch Kirill and his generation of bishops were ordained during the Soviet time, and critics say there could be no former KGB agents. In reality, the church leadership and patriarchs had to balance between God and Caesar, given their obedience and loyalty to the state, like the Bible teaches, and thus making the church life and worship possible and legal, but at the same time remaining a Christian church in a godless state was not an easy task. Different bishops, and especially patriarchs, understood this balance differently and acted differently. Whether they betrayed their church and their faith by doing so is up for debate. So what do you think? When was the Russian Orthodox Church born? Does it still exist as an authentic ancient Russian church? Is the modern church of the Moscow Patriarchate the same one as in the old days? Share your considerations in the comments. Please like the video, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you all next time.